So let's now output these expenses in a list. And for that, I'll replace this text widget here, which acted as a placeholder, with an actual list. But I'll not add this list here in this expenses state. Instead, I'll create a separate widget to keep this widget, or this state which belongs to the expenses widget, lean. And to especially keep its build function lean and simple, because that is considered a good practice. Keeping your build functions lean and not putting too much logic into them. That's typically what you want to strive for. So therefore here I'll add a new file, expenses_list.dart, sounds like a fitting file name, because in there I'll add a new class, the expenses list class, which now will be used for creating a widget. And therefore this must extend one of Flutter's widget base classes. And here a stateless widget is all we need, because we won't manage any internal data in that list. Instead, we'll just output the list of expenses that is defined here. We don't manage that list, we just output it. And therefore this will be a stateless widget. And of course it needs this build method. And in this build method, I then want to return my list in the end. Now, before we create that list, we of course must make sure that the expenses list widget class here accepts this list of expenses as input. For that, we need to add the constructor function, which here can be a const constructor function. And of course, we want to forward that key as always. But then I'll accept more named parameters because I want to have some properties in here. To be precise, I'll start with one property. We'll add another property later in this section. But this one property which I'll add here is my list of expenses. So here I'll use the built-in list type, and it's a generic type as you already know, and it is basically a list full of expenses. Hence I'll add my custom expense class, and by using this suggested option here, my editor also automatically adds this import to the expense.dart file. So here I'm using this expense type here to combine it with the list type. And then here this property can be named expenses. And I now also have this required named expenses parameter, which is used to assign a value to this expenses property. And now we can use this expenses property here in the build method to output this list of expenses. Now, thus far in the course, whenever we had multiple items that should be displayed above each other, we used the column widget. And this is a great widget for outputting widgets above each other. You can use it for list content too, therefore. But if you have lists of unclear length that could potentially get quite long, as it is the case here for this expenses list, users could add 100 or 1000 expenses when the app is up and running. So when you have a list of unknown length that will potentially get very long, column is not ideal. Because with column, all the widgets that you add to it will be created behind the scenes by Flutter whenever this widget that outputs this column becomes active. So that means if you have a list with 1000 items, all these items will be created behind the scenes by Flutter at the point of time where this list widget is displayed on the screen. The problem with that is, of course, that only a small amount of those expenses is actually needed, because only a small amount of the expense list items that will display here will be visible on the screen. We will have a scrollable list, of course, and most of those items therefore won't be visible initially. Hence, creating all these invisible items behind the scenes at the beginning is really redundant and costs a lot of performance. That's why you should not use column for lists where you don't know the length, but where you might have a lot of items in the end. Instead, Flutter gives you a different widget that should be used for such situations, and that's the ListView widget. Now, ListView can also be created like this, and you can pass children to it. If you do that, you get a scrollable list, which still creates all items immediately when this list is displayed on the screen. So the only thing we gain here is that this is automatically scrollable. But it's still not ideal for this scenario here, where we might have many items that won't be visible initially. Instead here, we should not use ListView like this, but use a special constructor that's offered by it, the builder constructor function. This is a special constructor function for this ListView widget, which in the end tells Flutter that it should create a scrollable list. List views are always scrollable lists by default, but that it should create those list items only when they are visible or about to become visible, not if they're not visible. For that, builder takes an item builder parameter, which is of type function, so which wants a function as a value. And of course, you learned before in the course already that you can pass functions as values for parameters. So that's what we need to do here. And it wants a function that will get two input values itself. Those will be provided automatically by Flutter. And it should then return a widget. So this function, which we pass as a value to item builder, should return a widget, the list item that should be created when needed. So for this here, I'll create an anonymous function. You could also create a separate method here and then just point at it. But here I'll go for an anonymous function. And I'll get a context object and an index value automatically provided by Flutter. That's what you can see here. And I'll get back to this index value a little bit later. And then we must return a widget. And for this, you could define your function like this and then return your widget here. Or you use this super short function form by using this arrow, where you then immediately define the value that should be returned. And I'll do that here, since all I want to do in this function is return a value. And the widget that should be returned here, in this case here, for a start, will simply be a text widget, though we'll change this later. And here in this text widget, I want to output the title of the expense which we are displaying here. Now for that, of course, we first of all need to tell Flutter which items it should build with this list view, because we're not doing this right now. To tell Flutter which items should be included, we can pass another parameter to this builder method, to this builder constructor function. Item builder is required, but we can also pass more arguments. As you can see, a long list of parameters that can be set actually. Now, these different parameters can be used to configure the behavior of ListView, and definitely feel free to browse through them, also with help of the official documentation. But here it's the item count parameter that should be set. Because item count in the end defines how many list items will be rendered eventually. And for that, of course, I want to pass the length of this expenses list as a value. So expenses.length. Because this built-in length property can be used to get the number of items in this expenses list that we get as an input here in this widget. And that number of items is exactly what we need as a value for item count, so that Flutter knows how many items should be displayed here. And that's now where this index becomes important. Flutter calls this function here, which we pass as a value to item builder, as often as defined here by item count in the end. So if item count is 2, because we have 2 items in our list, this function here will be called twice. And for every function call, index will be a different number. It will be 0 for the first item, because list indexes in Dart, as in many other programming languages, start at 0, as you already learned. And it will be 1 for the second item, therefore. So therefore here we can get the title of the expense for which a list item is being created here by reaching out to expenses, so to this expenses property, then using the square bracket notation, since expenses is a list, to access a specific expense by index. And then, of course, since we want to get the title of that expense, we use the dot notation on that single expense to which we now got access to access the title. And with that, we're outputting this expense title in a text widget here with help of this ListView widget provided by Flutter by using this builder constructor function to make sure that all the items are only created when they're needed. And if you have a long list of expenses, this can significantly improve the performance of your application.